January 31st, 1943, Stalingrad, the Volga. The radio message reached. Führer headquarters at 7:45. 6th Army has ceased to exist as a fighting force. No German officer present that morning would ever forget the silence that followed. For 10 minutes, no one spoke. Then General Jodl folded the slip of paper and said quietly, "That is the end of our Eastern dream." For 10 years, German officers had been told that the Reich's destiny was written in steel. The defeat at Stalingrad was not merely a lost battle. It was a fracture in faith. In the cold that swallowed Paulus's army, they saw the first shadow of their own destruction. Across Europe, telegrams began to arrive from field commands asking the same unspoken question: if Stalingrad can fall, what else can? In Paris, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt read the bulletin and said to his adjutant, "Now they will learn that history does not bend for slogans." His adjutant wrote in his diary that night. The old man spoke without emotion, but his hands trembled as he lit his cigarette. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler refused to hear the words surrender. He told his generals that fate itself has tested the German soldier and found him pure. Yet even those who nodded could feel something dying inside them. The idea that willpower could conquer logistics, that faith could replace fuel, was collapsing when Italy changed sides. In September 1943, the illusion shattered further. German officers sent to occupy their former allies' territory found chaos and resentment. Colonel General Albert Kesselring wrote home, "Our Italian friends greeted us with indifference. They have learned what it means to be liberated by Germany." The Wehrmacht, once seen as Europe's professional elite, was now stretched thin across continents. Every victory on the Eastern Front cost men and machines that could never be replaced. Factories bombed and the Ruhr could no longer meet demands, yet the propaganda ministry continued to broadcast triumph. The Führer fights on the Dnieper. New weapons will turn the tide. Inside officers' messes, laughter grew hollow. They still toasted the Reich, but the eyes above the glasses were tired. In December 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in France to inspect the coastal defenses that Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. What he found was mud, rust, and complacency. Concrete bunkers half-finished, artillery without ammunition, divisions composed of boys and convalescents. Rommel wrote to his wife, "They speak of an impregnable fortress. It is a facade of propaganda. We cannot stop the invasion. At best, we can delay it." He ordered more mines, more steel, more trenches, but inside he knew it was theater. No amount of barbed wire could halt a sea commanded by the Allies. During conferences in Paris, he argued with Rundstedt about how to fight the coming invasion. Rundstedt wanted to hold the panzer divisions inland. Rommel insisted they must be at the beaches, ready to strike before the Allies established a bridgehead. Once they are ashore, Rommel warned, "We have already lost." The debate was never settled because neither man truly believed their decisions mattered anymore. Both understood that Germany was fighting a war its industry could no longer sustain. Allied bombers ruled the sky by day. Partisans cut supply lines by night. Every officer felt the empire shrinking around him, mile by mile. Soul by soul. Excerpt from the diary of Major Karl Hollander, Army Group B, Staff Officer. January 1944. Our reports speak of numbers, of tonnage and battalions, but they conceal the real truth: fatigue. The men are exhausted, the officers hollowed out. We no longer fight for victory, but because stopping would mean admitting the lie. that lithe belief in the Reich's invincibility had been the glue of their world. To admit it false was to lose meaning itself. In Berlin, the new year began with promises of Wunderwaffe miracle weapons that would restore supremacy. V-2 rockets, jet fighters, invisible artillery. The officer corps listened politely, then turned back to the grim arithmetic of fuel and manpower. Even if the weapons worked, there would be no one left to use them. By February 1944, Rommel's reports to OKW grew blunt. "Our defenses are a patchwork," he wrote. "If the enemy attacks in strength, the coast will be lost in the first day." His candor earned him the Führer suspicion. Hitler had no patience for realism. He ordered that pessimists be replaced by believers. Belief, however, could not warm the hands of soldiers digging trenches in frozen sand. It could not replace rubber for tires or pilots for empty cockpits. The officers who inspected these defenses saw the end approaching like a tide slow, unstoppable, indifferent. In March, General Hans Speidel joined Rommel as Chief of Staff. He later wrote, "We worked not to win, but to delay Judgment Day. Every bunker poured, every mine laid, bought another week of illusion." That month, Allied bombers struck Berlin in daylight for the first time. Columns of smoke rose above the capital while the propaganda ministry broadcast symphonies. Officers on leave walked the streets and saw the faces of civilians who no longer looked up when sirens wailed. The homeland itself had grown numb within the general staff. Whispers began about seeking terms with the West. Some spoke cautiously of a separate peace, others of saving Germany from Hitler. These were treasonous thoughts, yet they spread like cracks in glass. The defeat at Stalingrad had wounded pride. The disaster in Italy had destroyed faith. Now the waiting for the invasion devoured hope. In April 1944, Rommel inspected defenses along the Channel coast. Everywhere he went, he asked the same question: "What will you do when they land?" The officers answered with rehearsed confidence, but their eyes betrayed them. They had seen the reconnaissance planes overhead, heard the night bombers pounding railways, and knew the Allies were coming. On April 22nd, Rommel wrote his most famous report to Hitler. "The enemy's air superiority is so overwhelming that every movement by day brings destruction. Without command of the air, our ground forces are helpless." The report was ignored. In Berlin, Keitel dismissed it as defeatism. "The field marshal sees ghosts," he told Jodl. But the ghosts were real, and they were approaching across the Channel. By May 1944, the mood among senior officers bordered on fatalism. Rundstedt told a visiting colonel, "When the invasion comes, it will decide the war within 24 hours. If we cannot throw them back into the sea, Germany is finished." The colonel wrote those words in his notebook and underlined them twice. On May 30th, Rommel returned from an inspection of the Normandy sector and told Speidel quietly, "They are coming soon. Everything depends on the first day, and I no longer believe in miracles." Speidel's diary for that night reads, "We live between the lie we must tell Berlin and the truth we see with our own eyes. It is a strange condition to prepare for battle we know we cannot win. Under a leader we no longer trust, for a nation that cannot speak the truth. Outside, Allied bombers thundered across the sky, shaking the windows of the chateau where Rommel slept. The walls of the Reich were already trembling. All that remained was the storm that would bring them down." February 1944. The Reich still spoke the language of victory, but the front lines spoke the language of exhaustion. Every new communiqué from the East began with the same phrase: "In heavy defensive fighting." a euphemism that meant retreat. For the first time since 1939, German officers were no longer calculating how far they could advance, but how long they could endure. At Army Group South, General Monstein submitted his final report on the Dnieper. It was clinical, precise, and hopeless. Our forces are overstretched. No reserves remain. Without fuel and air support, withdrawal is the only option. Hitler read the summary and wrote in the margin, defeatist. Hold at all costs. The phrase, hold at all costs, became the new national prayer command repeated. So often it lost meaning. Among the officer corps, private diaries began to replace official orders as the true record of the war. General Blumentritt noted, "We used to speak of honor. Now we speak of survival. The Führer commands the impossible, and we obey to prove our loyalty. But what loyalty remains when reality itself contradicts him?" Across occupied Europe, the illusion of control was slipping. In France, partisans derailed trains weekly. In Italy, German garrisons fought both Allied troops and civilians. The occupation had become a siege of conscience. Colonel Rudolf Hoffmann wrote to his brother, "We are defending ruins. The people hate us, and our own soldiers begin to question why they die for towns we will abandon next month." The Luftwaffe's decline was the most visible sign of decay. Once the symbol of Nazi modernity, it was now reduced to scattered squadrons that flew only at dawn or dusk. Allied bombers owned the skies. Every daylight journey became a gamble. Rommel's staff learned to move by night and sleep underground by day. When they surfaced, the countryside looked as if giants had walked through it, crushing everything underfoot. In April, the first fragments of captured Allied equipment arrived at the testing grounds in Kummersdorf. Sherman tanks, radar units, fragments of aircraft. German engineers studied them with a mixture of admiration and despair. Their technology is simple, reliable, and infinite in number, one officer observed. Ours is brilliant, fragile, and few. The words circulated among staff officers like a forbidden confession. Genius could no longer compensate for quantity. The general staff clung to statistical optimism. New divisions were announced on paper: Panzer, Lehr, 12th SS Hitlerjugend, but those who inspected them saw that half their strength consisted of boys born after 1926. They saluted sharply and shouted slogans with the confidence of youth, but they lacked the experience to know what awaited them. Major Hans Wolf, training near Cannes, wrote, "They believe this will be like Poland or France. None of them have seen Russia. They think courage alone can stop bombs." In Berlin, Goebbels preached that the hour of destiny approached. To men like Rundstedt, those words sounded less like prophecy than funeral liturgy. He kept a small notebook in which he recorded what he dared not say aloud. The war is lost militarily. The question that remains is how long the Führer will drag the nation with him into ruin. He was not alone. Conversations at headquarters became coded confessions. Officers no longer asked, "Can we win?" They asked, "What will happen to Germany when we lose?" Each answered in whispers: occupation, partition, vengeance. The thought of Soviet retribution haunted them more than defeat itself. Through the winter and spring of 1944, Rommel drove endlessly along the French coast. He examined bunkers, questioned engineers, and watched peasants clearing rubble from bombed bridges. He seemed tireless, yet those closest to him saw a man consumed by foreknowledge. Captain Helmuth Lang remembered. He would stare at the sea for minutes, silent, then say, "They will come here. And when they come, everything will change. The Atlantic Wall grew daily more concrete. More mines, but even its builders called it a wall of sand. Every time Allied bombers struck a sector, the engineers had to start again. Supply convoys from Germany were attacked before reaching the front. Fuel shortages meant even inspection vehicles were rationed. In May, Rommel ordered captured French laborers released to work on farms rather than fortifications. Food will matter more than fortresses, he told Speidel. Speidel's private notes from that month read, Rommel has become fatalistic. He speaks of the end openly, though never before soldiers. He says Germany's salvation now depends on the courage to face reality, yet reality is forbidden. The inner circle at the wolf's lair still lived inside the bubble of faith. To them, reports of shortages were talk of defeat was treason. When General Guderian tried to warn Hitler about the crumbling Eastern Front, Hitler struck the table with his fist. My generals know nothing of spirit. He shouted, I alone possess the will to victory. It was will against physics, faith against arithmetic. Officers who returned from the front knew the difference, but few dared to speak. The Gestapo's reach extended even into field headquarters. One careless remark over schnapps could end in a trial for defeatism. We have learned to lie fluently, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Werner Hennig. First to the Führer, then to one another, and finally to ourselves. By late May, the Allies had achieved near-total air supremacy. The French countryside shimmered with the constant movement of contrails. Every day thousands of planes crossed the sky eastward, and every day German officers watched them, powerless. Rommel measured the odds in practical terms. Fuel, tonnage, manpower. They have 10 of everything for every one of ours, he told Rundstedt. This is not a contest of soldiers, it is a contest of factories. Rundstedt replied, then factories will decide the war, and we have already lost. Neither man smiled. They both knew the truth had become indecent to speak. In June, Allied deception operations reached their climax. Fake armies assembled in southeast England. Radio traffic simulated preparations for Calais. German intelligence dutifully reported what it heard, confirming Hitler's conviction that Normandy was a diversion. In the official situation maps at OKW, red arrows pointed to the Pas de Calais as the invasion point. Reality was preparing to land elsewhere. On the evening of June 5th, a storm swept across the Channel. Rain lashed the bunkers. Wind tore at telephone wires. Many German officers believed the weather guaranteed another week of calm. Rommel, confident enough to drive home for his wife's birthday, told Speidel they will not come in this storm. He would be wrong by a matter of hours at midnight. Radar stations along the coast picked up echoes too many, too organized. Then the first reports arrived. Parachutes over Cotentin, gliders near Cannes, within minutes. The phones were ringing in every command post from Cherbourg to Le Havre. The invasion had begun in his diary. Major Wolfe scribbled one line before leaving for the front. The war has entered its last act. From that hour forward, time accelerated. Officers who had lived for years in certainty now felt the ground tilt beneath them. At first they sought to believe that this landing would be repelled like Dieppe in 1942, but as dawn broke and the horizon filled with ships, then thousands, the illusion crumbled. Rommel's driver later recalled the field marshal's face when he returned to headquarters and saw the reports stacked on the table. It was the face of a man who had seen the future and did not wish to live in it. For the rest of that day, the phones never stopped ringing, nor did the artillery. Yet beneath the noise, the officers felt a strange quiet forming inside them, a certainty colder than fear. The miracle Hitler promised would not come. The Reich had crossed the invisible line between power and decline, and there would be no return. By late May 1944, France had become a continent of whispers. From Calais to Cherbourg, every village waited for a storm no one could describe, yet everyone expected. The Atlantic Wall stretched for 2,600 kilometers, a mosaic of concrete bunkers, gun casemates, and optimism. To the propaganda ministry, it was a symbol of German genius. To the men who built it, it was an epitaph written in steel. Field Marshal Rommel returned from Berlin on May 31st and drove west under low clouds. His car passed endless convoys of ox-drawn carts and horse-mounted patrols, Germany's modern army moving backward through time. He took notes as he went. Bridges still unmined, artillery without ammunition, telephone lines exposed to the sky. The Atlantic Wall was more myth than fortress. At a staff meeting in La Roche-Guyon, Rommel spread a map across the table and tapped the Norman coast. "Here," he said, "between the Orne and the Vior. If they land here, we must destroy them on the beaches, or we will never destroy them at all." General Speidel answered quietly, "Then we must hope to be lucky in our first hour." Rommel looked up. Luck is for the side that owns the sky. They both knew who owned it. Every day Allied aircraft crossed France as if no German defenses existed. The noise had become background to life itself, mechanical heartbeat of inevitability. Civilians stopped looking up. Soldiers stopped counting. The Reich had lost control of the heavens, and with it, of the war doddery of Major Ernst Bauer. 15th Army, Calais Sector, June 3, 1944. Orders continue to insist the main invasion will strike at Calais. Yet the maps we intercept show intense activity opposite Normandy. We live between two certainties, the one Berlin desires and the one our eyes perceive. To speak of the second is to invite ruin. That same night, Rundstedt telephoned the OKW in Berlin to request full authority over the armored divisions in northern France. Keitel refused. "The Führer will direct them personally." Rundstedt replaced the receiver and muttered to his aide, "Then the Führer can lose them personally." In those last days before the storm, time seemed to dilate. Officers wrote letters home, cleaned pistols, checked maps they would soon abandon. To outward eyes they were calm. Inwardly, they waited for a reckoning that would judge not only strategy but faith. Rommel confessed to his wife, "I sometimes feel like a man building dikes against the sea. We work feverishly, yet the tide will come all the same." At the chateau headquarters, evenings were subdued. No more boasts of victory, no drunken songs of the early campaigns. Only the scratch of pens, the clicking of typewriters, the rustle of maps folded and refolded. Hope had thinned to habit. June 5, 1944, the barometer dropped sharply. Rain swept inland, beating against the windows. Reports from meteorological stations promised the storm would last for days. Rommel saw an opportunity to visit his family for Lucy's birthday. He left orders that he could be reached by radio should the invasion come. His driver later recalled, he looked almost relieved, as if the sea itself had granted him reprieve. At 22 o'clock, General Blumentritt dined with his staff in St. Lay. The talk was weary, the wine thin. "Perhaps the English fear our weather more than our guns," someone joked. Laughter was the last illusion of control they possessed. Then, just after midnight, telephones began to ring. Reports of parachutes over the Côte, gliders near Saint-Mere, unconfirmed, unbelievably and yet unmistakable. The long-awaited invasion was unfolding in darkness in Cherbourg. Major Bauer's diary ends mid-sentence. Flashes on the horizon too many for an exercise. By 1:30, every German command post along the Norman coast was awake. Messages poured in faster than they could be decoded. Rundstedt was roused from sleep and informed that Allied forces had landed in multiple sectors. Where? He demanded. No one knew. Radar returns showed an armada, so vast that individual fleets could not be distinguished. Speidel telephoned Rommel's residence near Ulm. The field marshal's aide answered. Herr Feldmarschall has retired. Shall I wake him? Speidel hesitated a heartbeat, then said, Yes. Tell him the invasion has begun. Lucy Rommel later recalled her husband standing at the window, listening to the rain. So, he said quietly, it begins. Within minutes he was dressed and on the road, racing through the night toward France. As dawn approached, the horizon over Normandy glowed faintly, not sunrise gunfire. From miles inland, officers heard the low thunder of naval bombardment rolling like distant weather. Entire sections of the Atlantic wall disappeared under the barrage. Telephone lines went dead. Observation posts ceased answering. General Wilhelm Rich, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, reported at 5:20, enemy landings in strength between Corsels and Weierstrom. At 5:37, all communications to the coast cut. Request immediate panzer support. There would be none. The armored divisions still waited for permission from Hitler, who was asleep at the Berghof. No one dared wake him. Rundstedt slammed his fist on the table. Then we shall lose France while the Führer dreams of victory. He ordered every available reserve to move toward the coast, regardless of authorization. History will judge me later, he said. If there is history left to judge, for the soldiers on the beaches, the day was a symphony of chaos. Machine gun nests fired until buried. Batteries went silent one by one. From observation posts, officers watched the sea covered with ships, so many that the water itself seemed armored. A young lieutenant wrote in his notebook before the line was overrun, "They are endless. The channel is alive with steel. We shoot, and still they come. God help Germany." By mid-morning, Allied troops had secured beachheads at Omaha, Juneau, and gold, the myth of the invincible Atlantic Wall, died before lunch. Rommel arrived at La Roche-Guyon shortly after 10 a.m., mud splattered up to his boots. He read the reports in silence. "How strong are they?" he asked. Speidel answered, "All of them, I think." Rommel nodded slowly. "Then it is finished." Those who heard the words never forgot them. They were not shouted, not even whispered with bitterness, simply stated as fact, as if describing the weather. The sentence marked the psychological collapse of a generation that had been taught that will could shape destiny. Now, destiny had arrived wearing khaki and naval grey. Throughout the afternoon, Rommel tried to coordinate counterattacks, but communications were broken and the sky filled with Allied aircraft. Every road movement was strafed. Every column burned. By nightfall, it was clear that the beachheads could not be pushed back. The invasion had succeeded, and with it, the end of the German dream of conquest. That night, Speidel wrote in his diary, "We are witnesses to the death of an idea." The Reich was built on the belief that discipline and faith could command the future. Today, the future landed on the beaches and refused to obey. In Berlin, Hitler finally awoke to the news at 10 a.m. and raged for hours, insisting Normandy was a diversion. Orders flew back and forth, while reality unfolded without him. By the time he released the armored divisions, the tide had turned, literally and militarily. Tanks that might have reached the coast at dawn arrived 2 days late, into a world already lost as June 6th ended. The beaches lay carpeted with wreckage-burned tanks. Twisted obstacles, the bodies of the young and the faithful. German officers walked among them at dusk, silent. They had obeyed every order, defended every inch, and still the sea had conquered them. Rommel watched the horizon darken. To his aide, he said, "The enemy's strength is not their weapons. It is their endless resources. We cannot fight numbers. We cannot fight the world." Then, almost to himself, he added, "The war has passed beyond us." The morning after the invasion smelled of smoke and salt. Normandy's fields burned. Its hedgerows hid men who no longer believed in orders. For the first time in 5 years of war, German officers spoke not of strategy but of meaning. Rommel spent that dawn touring what was left of the coastal divisions. The 716th had ceased to exist. The 352nd fought in fragments. He drove past columns of prisoners, his own soldiers, dazed and grey-faced, led away by men half their age. "They look relieved," he said softly. Relief was the new rebellion. At headquarters, the reports were unreadable. Allied armor at Bayer, airborne troops linking with beachheads, naval gunfire annihilating any counterattack. Rundstedt ordered withdrawal lines, then rescinded them under pressure from OKW. Every message from Berlin began with the same lie: local setback. Situation under control. By June 10th, the lie had become unbearable. Rundstedt telephoned Keitel directly. "Make peace, for God's sake. Can't you see the war is lost?" Keitel's reply was mechanical. "The Führer forbids defeatist talk." Rundstedt hung up and murmured to his aide, "Then tell the Führer he can make peace himself." Within days he was dismissed. The front collapsed not as a line but as a belief. Allied air power erased daylight movement. German convoys hid in forests until nightfall, then drove without headlights. Command posts moved hourly to escape bombardment. Every mile westward felt heavier than a campaign east. They were retreating into themselves. Speidel wrote in his diary, "Rommel has ceased to speak of victory. He now speaks of saving lives." The word honor has changed meaning. It means telling the truth, even if no one will hear it. On June 17th, Rommel met with Hitler at the Bund. He tried once more to speak plainly. "My Führer, the invasion cannot be repelled. Our troops are exhausted, our air force destroyed, our industry broken. We must seek an end to the fighting." Hitler's eyes hardened. "You will not repeat the mistakes of 1918. There will be no surrender." Rommel realized then that he was speaking to a man who no longer lived in the same century. As he left the room, he told Keitel, "The war is already over. The only question is how long it will take him to realize it." Through June and July, the German armies bled in the bocage. Every hedge became a fortress, every village a grave. The Allies advanced meter by meter, not because they were invincible, but because they were infinite. German officers compared it to drowning. One wave receded only to reveal another behind it. Letters home changed tone. Colonel Karl Moss wrote to his wife, "Do not believe what the radio says. We no longer fight for victory, but for decency to withdraw our men before they are destroyed. Propaganda posters still promised Vergelten revenge weapons, counterblows miracles, but the men at the front joked bitterly. Our wonder weapon is time, and time is against us. By early July, rumors spread of conspirators in Berlin plotting to end the madness. They called it Operation Valkyrie. Some officers whispered approval. Others feared the Gestapo more than defeat. Rommel, now openly critical of Hitler, was approached indirectly through his staff. He listened in silence. "If it ends the killing," he said, "then it must be done. But God help Germany afterward." His diaries from those days are fragments, half-thoughts, questions without answers. Is loyalty still a virtue when it serves insanity? Can obedience absolve us of what obedience created? July 17th, 1944. Rommel's car was strafed by an Allied fighter near Lviv. The windshield exploded. The vehicle flipped. He was pulled unconscious from the wreckage, skull fractured, face mutilated. As surgeons worked, word spread that the only man Hitler still trusted in the West lay between life and death. For many officers it felt symbolic. The body of Germany itself, broken by the very storm it had summoned. 3 days later, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under a table in the Wolf's Lair. The explosion shook. East Prussia, but not history. Hitler lived, and the dream of saving Germany died with the conspirators. That night, radio broadcasts declared the Führer had survived by divine will. In Paris, officers listened in silence. Speidel noted, "The room smelled of smoke and fear." Each of us understood that from this hour forward, no dissent, no reason, no mercy would remain. We are condemned men still breathing. The purge that followed consumed the officer corps. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens hanged with piano wire in Berlin. Rundstedt, recalled to duty in desperation, watched the executions on newsreel and said, "This is no longer an army. It is a cult awaiting its apocalypse." Rommel, recovering in his garden at Hell, received a visit from 2 generals on October 14th. They offered a choice: face trial for treason or take poison and be honored as a hero. He asked for 10 minutes with his wife, then walked into his car and never returned. His death was announced as the result of wounds sustained in battle. Lucy Rommel later wrote, "He died believing that truth might still mean something." After Rommel's death, the officers who remained knew the truth, but lacked the courage or strength to act upon it. They commanded armies that no longer existed, issued orders to divisions that existed only on maps. In their diaries, words like fate, inevitable, and retribution replaced victory. The realization that had begun at Stalingrad now became absolute. Speidel ended his July journal with a single line: "The war has ended inside us. Only the killing continues." The retreat from Normandy did not look like a retreat. It looked like exodus. Columns of trucks, carts, and weary soldiers stretched for miles along roads pounded into dust. The sky, always filled with Allied planes, vibrated with the hum of inevitability. Officers no longer spoke of front lines, but of areas of survival. Field Marshal Model, sent to replace Rommel, inspected the remnants of Army Group B and tried to impose order. His optimism was relentless, mechanical. "We will stabilize the front," he told his subordinates. "We always have." Yet even he could see the numbers. Divisions that should have counted 15,000 men now barely fielded 5. Fuel reserves measured in days, not weeks. Artillery shells rationed like bread. In the chaos of the Falaise pocket, tens of thousands of Germans were encircled. Rommel's prophecy came true in his absence. Once they are ashore, we will never throw them back. For 3 days the valley burned. General Eberbach, commanding the 7th Army, later wrote from captivity, "We were slaughtered from the air." It was no longer war, but execution. The fields were full of horses screaming. No man who saw that valley could ever again believe in destiny. When the survivors staggered eastward, France collapsed behind them. By the end of August, Paris had risen in revolt. Hitler ordered it destroyed, bridges mined, monuments blown, but General von Choltitz refused. He told his aide, "I will not be remembered as the man who murdered Paris." His act of disobedience saved a city and condemned him in Berlin's eyes. Everywhere the same pattern repeated: retreat, order, collapse, punishment. Officers who told the truth were dismissed. Those who lied were promoted. The system had devoured itself. Rundstedt returned again to command what could no longer be commanded. He told his staff, "My orders are dreams written on paper." The diaries of late 1944 are filled with imagery of ghosts. Major Dietrich Witzleben wrote from the Siegfried Line, "At night I hear the guns from the west and the east. They sound alike. We are the space between them. The men still dig, still obey, but their eyes are empty. They have already gone home in their minds." In Berlin, Goebbels declared total war. Civilians were conscripted, teenagers given Panzerfausts, old men uniforms. The officer corps watched with grim irony. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years now scavenged its own children. For soldiers, September brought new humiliation. Allied troops entered Belgium, then Holland. The once dreaded Wehrmacht now fought village to village, house to house, clinging to ruins. German officers felt the moral inversion of history, no longer conquerors but the conquered. General Kurt Student, captured after a failed counterattack, said simply, "We have become what we once pitied." In their private writings, the language of faith disappeared. They no longer mentioned the Führer except as a curse. "He lives in a fantasy," wrote Speidel. "He believes new divisions exist because they are listed on his maps. I have walked among the men and found only exhaustion and silence." By October, the Allies stood on the German frontier. Cities like Aachen fell after brief sieges. For the first time since 1940, enemy soldiers stood on German soil. The psychological impact was immense. Civilians had been told for years that the war was far away, that victory was near. Now they heard foreign guns in their own valleys. Inside the officer corps, a strange mixture of guilt and fatalism took hold. Some clung to professionalism, schedules, neat maps, anything that kept chaos at bay. Others turned inward, writing confessions disguised as reports. General Blumentritt's October memorandum reads less like strategy than penance. "We built an army on obedience and forgot conscience. We taught generations that duty was above thought. Now we reap the harvest of that creed. Obedience has led us into ruin, and still we obey." The winter approached, again, cold and pitiless. Hitler demanded an offensive in the west, the last throw of the dice. His generals listened in disbelief. They knew the reserves no longer existed, yet none dared refuse. To say no was to sign one's death warrant. On December 16, 1944, the Ardennes offensive began under a cloak of fog. At first it seemed a miracle. American lines buckled, towns captured, prisoners taken. Propaganda screamed of victory renewed. But within days, the fog lifted, and Allied aircraft returned. The miracle evaporated in fire. Colonel Friedrich Engels, no relation to the philosopher, wrote from the front, "We believed for 48 hours that history would forgive us. Then the sky cleared, and we saw our punishment. By Christmas, the offensive was over. The German army had spent its last strength on a dream. The officers who survived knew it was the end. They stood amid burning forests and white snow stained black with fuel, understanding that they were fighting not for a nation but for the collusion that their suffering still meant something. The year closed with defeat on every front. In the east, the Red Army prepared its winter assault. In the west, Allied troops massed along the Rhine. Berlin still issued orders with perfect grammar, but the men who received them read between the lines, "Prepare to die." Speidel's final entry for 1944 reads, "The silence after bombardment is like the silence of confession. We have seen the truth and cannot unsee it. Germany will be destroyed, not by bombs alone, but by the weight of our own obedience." He closed his notebook and did not open it again until after the surrender. January 1945. Germany was a country of whispers and smoke. Cities no longer had centers-only directions where ruins thickened. Railways ended in craters, and the rivers ran with debris. From the east came the rumble of an army that seemed less like men than a moving storm. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula. The Western Front had cracked along the Ardennes. The Reich that once measured conquest in kilometers now measured existence in days. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt watched the retreat from the Western command post at Koblenz. His maps had become memorials. "Every black line," he told an aide, "marks a road we have already lost." When reports reached him that Hitler intended to hold the Rhine to the last cartridge, he smiled without mirth. "The last cartridge," he said, "was fired 2 years ago. We just haven't noticed." After the failure in the Ardennes, Hitler's rage grew theatrical. Conferences turned into sermons on faith. He quoted Frederick the Great, Napoleon, even the Bible, anything, to prove that will could rewrite reality. The generals listened in silence, eyes lowered. To contradict him was suicide. To agree was madness. Colonel General Heinrici, ordered to defend the Oder line, wrote in his field journal, "We fight not for Germany, but for the illusion of Germany. Every division destroyed buys the Führer another day to dream." At the front, soldiers dug into frozen ground with bare hands. Ammunition crates arrived half empty. Rations were moldy or non-existent. Yet still the slogans came, victory or death. The officers who once planned blitzkrieg now plotted evacuations of civilians, of archives, of consciences. In February, Allied bombers turned Dresden into a furnace. The flames were visible for 60 kilometers. Reports reached Berlin by morning. Hitler called it proof that surrender was impossible. The enemy wants annihilation, not negotiation. 2 men like Speidel, now dismissed and under suspicion, sounded like a confession. General Blumentritt noted in his diary, "After Dresden, there is no more talk of humanity, only endurance. We have become the thing we feared, a people without mercy, because mercy would mean admitting guilt." In the West, the Americans crossed the Rhine at Remagen. Photographs of the intact bridge reached newspapers worldwide. In Hitler's headquarters, the reaction was hysteria. He ordered the immediate execution of every officer responsible for the sector. Rundstedt tried to protest, then stopped himself. "Why argue with a corpse?" he muttered. He was relieved of command 2 days later. Everywhere, order decayed into ritual. Divisions existed only on paper. Staffs commanded ghosts. The code words for retreat were rewritten daily to sound like advance. General Bush sent one final report from Army Group H. "We hold the Rhine firmly." In the margin he added in pencil, "For another 24 hours." In these months, the officers began to see the war as a moral reckoning. They had built their careers on precision, hierarchy, obedience, and now those virtues had turned to ash. Major Otto Ernst Riemer, once the man who suppressed the July plot, admitted to a comrade, "Perhaps we killed the only men who could have saved Germany." The words passed like contagion, guilt spoken, softly in cellars lit by candles. Berlin itself transformed into a hallucination. Trams still ran through rubble. Policemen directed imaginary traffic. Goebbels's posters promised Enzi final victory, while children with wooden rifles paraded in the streets. Officers on leave walked among them with hollow courtesy. To salute was to lie. Not to salute was treason. Rommel was gone, Rundstedt disgraced, Guderian shouting into void. Only fragments of the old general staff remained, bound together by habit more than hope. They met in cellars that smelled of damp paper and despair, arguing over bridgeheads that no longer existed. When one colonel suggested negotiating with the West, another warned, "The Führer hears everything." No one laughed. They all believed it. March 1945 brought thaw and revelation. Rivers flooded, exposing corpses frozen since winter. Refugees streamed west, women pushing carts, children carrying bundles of photographs. Officers tried to control the flow, then gave up. The front and the homeland had merged into one moving wound. At night they heard artillery from both horizons. The war was closing like a pair of jaws. Some prayed for a miracle. Others prayed for an ending. General Buss wrote to his wife, "The only victory left is to die without hatred." In the final week of March, the Allies broke through at Wessel. The Rhine, once Hitler's promised barrier, became another open door. Eisenhower refused to halt. German officers watching from the opposite bank saw columns of American armor crossing under a sun that seemed indifferent. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Betcher, recorded, "I realized then that the world continues even when we end." That was harder to bear than defeat. By the end of March, the Western Front had dissolved. The remnants of the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Elbe, toward the myth of salvation through surrender to the Americans rather than the Russians. Maps were drawn not to plan operations, but to guess where captivity might be most humane. Hitler, still in his bunker, issued orders for armies that existed only in his imagination. Army Group Vistula, Army Group Steiner. Officers received the commands, filed them dutifully, and then ignored them. The bureaucracy of delusion functioned perfectly until the very end. Speidel, now in hiding, heard the radio broadcast of Hitler's latest speech and wrote in the margin of a newspaper, "He speaks to ghosts," and the ghosts applaud. April 1945. The German Reich was no longer a country but a labyrinth of ruins connected by fear. Trains no longer ran to destinations, only away from them. Civilians walked along rail lines carrying children, dogs, and silence. Every sound of artillery echoed like prophecy. The Red Army had reached the Oder. In the west, American tanks crossed the Elbe. The circle was closing. For the surviving officers, there were no longer fronts-only directions from which death approached. General Heinrici, commanding the last real army on the Eastern Line, studied maps that had become irrelevant overnight. "I can give them hours," he told his staff. Not victorias. His men fought with ghost-like precision, delaying the inevitable with the elegance of habit. Behind them, villages burned like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. In Berlin, the world had collapsed into the underground. Hitler's bunker was a tomb with telephones. The air smelled of sweat, damp concrete, and the slow decay of faith. His officers still addressed him as Mein Führer, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion. They were prisoners of etiquette. When reports arrived that the Soviets had entered the suburbs, Hitler ordered phantom armies into Mochensteiner from the north, Wenck from the south. The names echoed through the bunker like prayer in an empty church. The generals knew those armies existed only on paper. No one contradicted him. They had stopped trying to change reality. They simply waited for it. General Jodl wrote in his final notes, "Our duty has become to appear calm while the structure dissolves. There is no command, only inertia disguised as loyalty." Above ground, the city was unrecognizable. Every street a trench, every building a fortress of civilians. Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts crouched behind rubble, firing at tanks older than their fathers. Officers passed them and looked away. To intervene was useless. To care was unbearable. Inside the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Goebbels rehearsed speeches for a nation that no longer existed. He promised that Germany would rise again in spiritual victory. Even his stenographers stopped typing. The words sounded like an afterlife nobody wanted. The last surviving field commanders wrote their own epitaphs in diaries. General Buss of the Ninth Army, "We are no longer soldiers, we are witnesses. The faith that built the Reich now buries it. Each order we carry out is a shovel of earth on our own grave." Rundstedt, old and forgotten, refused further commands. "At 70, I have seen 2 Germanys die," he said. This one deserved the mercy of understanding, and found none. The younger officers clung to fragments of decency. Some organized corridors for civilians to flee the Russians. Others destroyed documents, not from loyalty, but shame. The ideal of the Prussian, officer duty, discipline, honor had become a parody performed in the ruins of its birthplace. On April 16th, the Battle of Berlin began. The sky itself seemed to fall. 3 million shells struck the city in 7 days. The ground shook continuously. Fires burned without oxygen. Those who survived underground measured time by the vibration of artillery. Between bombardments, they could hear the screams of civilians trapped in burning buildings. General Helmuth Weidling, appointed to command Berlin's defense, tried to organize coherence from catastrophe. "We will defend every block," he told his subordinates. One colonel replied, "There are no blocks left to defend." Weidling nodded. "Then we defend the ashes." As the Soviets closed in, despair turned inward. Officers who once commanded divisions now guarded street corners. Some took poison. Others vanished. On April 21st, Speer entered the bunker and found Hitler hunched over a map, hands trembling, eyes unfocused. "They are only 10 kilometers away," Speer said. Hitler whispered, "Then we shall stay here." For the first time, his generals believed him. In those last days, Berlin became a city of suicide notes. Officers, party officials, families, they all chose their endings. Cyanide capsules were traded like currency. Silence became the only loyalty left. Weidling's men continued fighting out of reflex. Every building captured was recaptured within hours. Ammunition ran out. Communications failed. When his staff begged him to surrender, he hesitated. "I was trained to obey," he said. Now obedience is a crime. On April 30th, word spread through the tunnels, Der Führer ist tot. Hitler had shot himself. The message passed from mouth to mouth without emotion. No cheers, no mourning, just an exhausted pause. As if the city itself had exhaled after 12 years of holding its breath. May 1st, Goebbels followed with his family. Others soon after. The bunker emptied into history. Above ground, Soviet soldiers planted red flags over the Reichstag, the smoke turning them grey dot. In the west, German units raced to surrender to the Americans, not the Russians. Columns of vehicles streamed toward the Elbe, waving white sheets torn from beds. Officers who had once sworn oaths of eternal loyalty now introduced themselves to enemy captains with relief. "Thank God it's you," one major said to an American lieutenant. "I feared it would be the others." At Flensburg, Admiral Dönitz formed a phantom government that lasted less than 3 weeks. The remaining generals gathered around him like ghosts at a wake. The telegram announcing Germany's unconditional surrender was read aloud in a tone that was neither sorrow nor joy, just release. General Alfred Jodl signed the document on May 7th. His signature shook slightly. When he handed back the pen, he said quietly, "With this, we put an end to 1,000 years of history." The Allied officer beside him replied, "No, General. You end 12. The next morning, the war that had devoured a continent ended in radio silence. Across the ruins, people listened to the news and did not react. Tears required energy, and energy had been spent long ago. Those officers who survived captivity began to write memoirs, diaries, explanations. Some sought redemption, others sought meaning. A few admitted the truth without disguise. Speidel, awaiting interrogation, wrote his final entry. "We believed discipline was strength, and it became our blindness. We built a machine that obeyed too well. When conscience returned, it was too late. I do not know if Germany will rise again, but I pray that obedience will never again be worshipped here." The ruins of Berlin smoldered through summer. Between the stones, flowers began to grow teeny, defiant, uninvited. Children played among wrecked tanks as if war were a story their parents had told them. The surviving officers watched in silence, unable to explain how faith had turned to fire. For them, the realization had come not in a single moment, but in a long, merciless unfolding from the Volga to Normandy to this. It was not defeat by arms, but by awakening. The empire had fallen the day they stopped asking why and started obeying how. In that awareness, they finally understood what Rommel had foreseen years earlier. The war will end not with the enemy's victory, but with our understanding of ourselves. The guns stopped, but the sound of them stayed. For months after May 1945, men who had survived on instinct alone woke to phantom detonations. The war lived on in nerves and memory, in the rhythmic pulse of absence. Germany was a map of silence divided into zones of occupation, its cities stripped to their bones. Those who had once commanded empires now stood in line for bread. The surviving generals were gathered in camps. Mondorf, Bad Mondorf, again under new management rows of barbed wire, enclosing an education in humility. They were interrogated, not with bullets but with questions. When did you know? Why did you obey? The questions cut deeper than defeat. Answers came slowly and never fully. General Blumentritt wrote from his cell, "We told ourselves we served Germany." In truth, we served fear of disorder, fear of conscience. We obeyed because we could not imagine life without orders. Others filled notebooks with explanations, diagrams, maps of lost honor. Some still called Hitler a genius, ruined by fate. Others admitted that the ruin had begun with them. A few, like Speidel, faced the tribunal of history with quiet resignation. He told his interviewer, "Obedience is easy. Responsibility is not." Outside the wire, the country tried to breathe again. Allied soldiers photographed the rubble. Civilians swept streets that no longer led anywhere. The myth of destiny had evaporated, leaving only the human, face-hungry, bewildered, alive. Churches reopened, courtrooms too. The Nuremberg proceedings began. Cameras recorded what had once been hidden. For the first time, the officers were forced to watch the war they had made. One of them, staring at film of liberated camps, whispered, "I did not know." Another replied, "We all knew, but not enough to stop." Between those two sentences lay the entire tragedy of a generation. Letters from captivity revealed more truth than any trial. General Buss to his wife, "They ask if I am guilty. I answer, I was obedient." Perhaps that is the same thing. Rundstedt, released for age and illness, lived quietly until 1953. Visitors found him staring out windows, speaking little. When asked what lesson he had drawn from the war, he said, "Never confuse discipline with virtue." Across Europe, monuments rose. But inside the minds of the officers, the real memorial was absence. The comrades left in frozen fields, the ideals burned to ash. They learned a new vocabulary: reconstruction, democracy, conscience. Words once dismissed as weakness now became lifelines. Speidel returned eventually to uniform, this time for a different Germany within a different alliance. In 1957, he addressed a class of young officers. The task of a soldier is not only to fight, but to think. If ever obedience demands the denial of humanity, disobedience becomes duty. The room fell silent. Those words were the ghost of all that had died in 1945. Now spoken aloud at last, the camera of history pulls back. The ruins have turned to streets again, trees grown through old trenches, rivers flowing as before. The voices that once shouted orders have faded into the archives, leaving behind photographs, journals, and the endless question of how belief becomes blindness in the end. The story of the officers is not about defeat by the Allies, but by awakening within themselves. They began as men who believed in destiny. They ended as men who understood consequence. Between those points lies the measure of an entire century. A line from Rommel's early letters survives. Written before Africa, before fame, a soldier must remain human even when the world forgets humanity. Otherwise, victory itself becomes another form of defeat. It was a warning unheard then, an epitaph understood only after everything was gone.